Foundations, context, atmosphere, and the world before the plague. In the early years of the 14th century, Europe stood at a fragile crossroads. The medieval world was deeply rooted in tradition, faith, and hierarchy, yet it was also quietly strained by forces it barely understood. Kingdoms rose and fell through dynastic marriages and brutal wars. The church stood as the supreme moral authority, and daily life revolved around the rhythms of the land. Fields were plowed by hand, villages clustered around churches, and cities, though growing, remained cramped, unsanitary, and vulnerable. The population of Europe had expanded steadily since the High Middle Ages. Better agricultural techniques had allowed villages to grow into towns, and towns into bustling urban centers. Markets overflowed with grain, wool, wine, and salt. Trade routes stretched from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, linking Europe with Asia and the Middle East through caravans and merchant ships. Yet this growth carried hidden dangers. Crowded living conditions, malnutrition among the poor, and a lack of medical knowledge created an environment ripe for catastrophe. Politically, Europe was restless. The 100 Years' War had begun to erupt between England and France, draining treasuries and lives alike. Lords demanded taxes, kings demanded loyalty, and peasants bore the weight of both. Famine had already struck hard in the early 1300s, especially during the Great Famine of 1315–1317, weakening bodies and spirits across the continent. Hunger left people vulnerable not only to despair, but to disease. Religion dominated every aspect of medieval life. God was seen as the guiding force behind fortune and disaster alike. Illness was often interpreted as divine punishment, a test of faith, or a sign of moral decay. Physicians, limited by ancient theories of humors and balance, could offer little more than prayers, bloodletting, and herbal remedies. Hospitals existed, but they were few, overcrowded, and ill-equipped. Beyond Europe's borders, the world was in motion. The Mongol Empire had connected vast regions of Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe through trade and conquest. Silk, spices, and precious metals moved swiftly across continents. Along with them traveled unseen passengers, fleas carried by rats, thriving in the holds of ships and the packs of caravans. Somewhere in Central Asia, a deadly bacterium stirred, waiting for the moment when human networks would carry it westward. In the port cities of the Mediterranean, life appeared vibrant and prosperous. Genoa, Venice, and Marseille thrived on maritime trade. Ships arrived daily, heavy with goods and sailors exhausted from long voyages. Few suspected that death itself was docking alongside them. When rumors began to circulate of a strange sickness in the east, of entire towns emptied and caravans abandoned, most dismissed them as distant tales, exaggerations unworthy of concern. Europe, confident in its traditions and blind to its vulnerabilities, stood unprepared. The stage was set for a calamity that would tear through every layer of society, reshape belief systems, and leave scars that would define an era. The calm before the storm was heavy, deceptive, and brief. Society under strain as the plague arrives and spreads. The plague arrived not with thunder, but with silence. In 1347, merchant ships from the Black Sea reached the shores of Sicily. Sailors stumbled ashore feverish and delirious, their bodies marked by dark swellings beneath the arms and along the neck. Within days, they were dead. Within weeks, the sickness spread beyond the docks, seeping into homes, markets, and churches. Panic followed swiftly. The disease moved faster than understanding, cutting across social boundaries with terrifying ease. Nobles fled their estates, abandoning servants and tenants. Wealth offered no protection. Kings, bishops, and merchants fell alongside beggars and laborers. Entire households vanished overnight. Bells tolled endlessly for the dead until there were no bell ringers left. Daily life collapsed under the weight of fear. Shops closed, fields lay unharvested, and courts ceased to function. In cities, the stench of death filled the air as corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Mass graves became common, hastily dug and poorly marked. Families were torn apart, as parents abandoned sick children and spouses turned away from one another in desperate self-preservation. Power structures faltered. Feudal obligations meant little when laborers were dying in vast numbers. Survivors found themselves suddenly in demand, able to negotiate higher wages or abandon oppressive lords altogether. This shift terrified the ruling class, who responded with harsh laws attempting to freeze wages and restrict movement. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, planting the seeds of future uprisings. Religion, once a source of comfort, became a battlefield of belief. Some clung more tightly to faith, forming processions and flagellant movements, whipping themselves in public to atone for humanity's sins. Others lost faith entirely, questioning how a just God could allow such suffering. The church itself was not spared. Priests died in droves while tending to the sick, leaving communities spiritually adrift. Scapegoats emerged as fear demanded answers. Minority communities, particularly Jewish populations, were accused of poisoning wells and conspiring with dark forces. Pogroms erupted across Europe, resulting in mass expulsions and killings. Violence spread alongside the disease, fueled by rumor, ignorance, and desperation. Trade networks, once symbols of prosperity, now served as arteries of death. The plague swept from Italy into France, Spain, England, and beyond, eventually reaching Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. No border could stop it. No army could fight it. By the early 1350s, it was clear that Europe was witnessing not a passing illness, but an existential crisis. The height of the plague, its aftermath and historical impact. At its height, the Bubonic Plague consumed the medieval world. Entire villages vanished from maps. Cities lost half their populations or more. Scholars estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's people died within a few short years. The scale of loss was unprecedented, leaving survivors surrounded by emptiness and silence. Yet from this devastation emerged transformation. With fewer workers, traditional feudal systems began to fracture. Labor gained value, and rigid social hierarchies slowly weakened. Peasants demanded better conditions, and some succeeded. Economic power shifted, laying early groundwork for the decline of serfdom and the rise of a more mobile workforce. Cultural attitudes also changed. Art and literature grew darker, more reflective, obsessed with mortality and the fragility of life. The image of death as a universal equal, king and peasant alike, entered the collective imagination. Medical thinking, though still limited, began to evolve as scholars questioned ancient authorities and sought empirical explanations for disease. The church, shaken but enduring, faced growing scrutiny. Its inability to prevent or explain the plague weakened its absolute authority, encouraging more personal and questioning forms of faith. This subtle shift would echo centuries later during major religious upheavals. By the late 1300s, the plague gradually receded, though it would return in waves for generations. Europe was forever changed. The world that emerged was not stronger, but different, more cautious, more questioning, and deeply marked by loss. The bubonic plague was not merely a tragedy of death. It was a turning point in human history, reshaping societies, economies, and beliefs. From the ashes of catastrophe arose the foundations of a new Europe, forged by suffering, resilience, and an enduring confrontation with mortality itself.